There are rules in the North Atlantic. They are old rules written in ice and salt. The most absolute among them is a simple calculation of time. In 28-degree water, the human heart stops in 20 minutes. It is a biological certainty. No amount of money, prayer, or prestige can bargain for a single second more. On April 15, 1912, that rule claimed 1,500 lives. The wealthiest men of the Edwardian age froze to death in their life jackets, surrounded by the wreckage of the unsinkable ship. They did everything right, and they died. But one man broke the rule. He was not a captain. He was not a millionaire. He was a baker, a man from the lower decks who watched the world end, took a drink from a bottle of whiskey, and stepped off the stern of the dying ship as calmly as if he were stepping off a curb. He floated in the killing dark for hours. He didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He simply refused to die. This is not the story of the Titanic you think you know. We are not looking at the band or the bridge or the iceberg. We are looking at the impossible biology of a miracle. Join me as we peel back the layers of history to examine the strange, forgotten truth of Charles Joughin, the man who found the one loophole in the laws of nature. So turn down the lights, settle in, and let's uncover the story of the man who beat the ice. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the middle of the North Atlantic. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a weight. It is the heavy, suffocating pressure of 1 billion tons of water pushing against the hull of a ship, a constant reminder that humanity is merely a visitor in a world designed for monsters. On the surface, the water is black, reflecting nothing but the indifference of the stars. Below, it is a graveyard that has been waiting for millions of years. But inside the steel belly of the RMS Titanic, there was no silence. There was only the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the industrial age. It was a sound that vibrated through the floorboards, traveled up the steel columns, and hummed in the teeth of every man, woman, and child aboard. It was the sound of coal shovels scraping against iron, the roar of furnaces hungry for fuel, and the thunder of reciprocating engines driving 3 massive propellers through the cold, resisting sea. Deep within the labyrinth of D-deck, far removed from the crystal chandeliers and the mahogany grand staircases, the air did not smell of salt or sea spray. It smelled of yeast. It smelled of flour dust and rising dough. It smelled of heat. Here, in the galleys and the bakery, the Titanic was not a floating palace. It was a factory. The ovens were massive cast-iron beasts that radiated a heat so intense it could blister skin if one stood too close for too long. They were never truly cold. Even at night, the embers glowed, keeping the temperature in the bakery hovering near a tropical humid warmth, a stark contrast to the freezing air just a few inches of steel away on the other side of the hull. In this sweltering underworld, time was not measured in leisure or luxury. It was measured in loaves. The chief baker, Charles Joughin, understood this measurement better than anyone. He was a man of the merchant service, 33 years old, with the kind of face that blended easily into a crowd, a dark mustache, receding hair, and eyes that had seen enough crossings to know that the ocean was a job site, not a view. He was a professional. He commanded a staff of 13 bakers, a small army dedicated to a single relentless purpose, feeding the city that floated above them. Consider the logistics of a floating city. 2,200 people, breakfast, lunch, dinner, supper. The first class required French rolls, brioche, croissants. The second class needed hearty white loaves. The third class, the steerage passengers packed into the lower decks, needed sustainment, dense, filling bread that could survive the journey. Joughin's world was a constant cycle of mixing, kneading, proofing, and baking. It was physical, exhausting labor. The flour dust coated everything. It settled in the eyelashes of the bakers, turned their eyebrows white, and filled the creases of their uniforms. They worked in shifts, their bodies adjusting to the unnatural rhythm of sleeping in bursts and waking to the heat of the ovens. On Sunday, April 14, 1912, the rhythm was perfect. The ship was steaming at near top speed, cutting through the water with an arrogance that felt entirely earned. The bakers had finished the evening rush. The massive galleys were quieting down, the clatter of pots and pans replaced by the low murmur of the night watch. Joughin had retired to his cabin. It was a small space, functional, devoid of the opulence found on the upper decks. But it was his sanctuary. He was off duty. The bread for the next morning was already proofing, the yeast slowly devouring the sugars, expanding, rising, preparing for the ovens. The system was working. There is a comfort in systems, in routines. The repetition of a job well done provides a false sense of security, a belief that because yesterday went according to plan, tomorrow will as well. Joughin lay in his bunk, feeling the gentle vibration of the ship. It was a lullaby of engineering. It whispered that everything was under control. It whispered that steel was stronger than water. It whispered that this ship, this unsinkable Leviathan, had conquered the elements. But out in the dark, the elements were changing. The temperature was dropping, not gradually, but with a sudden, violent steepness. In the span of a few hours, the air had gone from brisk to biting. The lookouts in the crow's nest, high above the warmth of the bakery, were weeping from the cold, their eyes streaming, blurring their vision. There was no moon. The horizon was a seamless weld between the black sky and the black water. The ocean was calm, too calm. There were no waves breaking at the base of the icebergs to warn of their presence. The water was flat as oil, hiding the massive shapes drifting into the shipping lanes. Down below, the crew knew the stories. Every sailor on the North Atlantic run knew about the ice. They whispered about it in the mess halls. They talked about the near misses, the ghostly white shadows that appeared out of the fog. But on the Titanic, these stories felt like myths from a primitive age. This was the 20th century. Man had mastered the radio. Man had mastered the steam engine. Man had built a ship so large it had its own weather patterns. The crew trusted the ship. They trusted the captain. They trusted the physics of watertight compartments. They believed that even if the worst happened, the ship would become its own lifeboat, a steel island that could wait out any storm. This faith was not arrogance. It was institutional. It was written into the training manuals. It was drilled into the officers. It was the foundation of their world. Lifeboat drills were a formality, often skipped or rushed, treated like a tedious paperwork exercise rather than a rehearsal for survival. Why practice abandoning a ship that could not sink? It was like practicing for gravity to fail. And so, the night of April 14th settled over the ship like a heavy blanket. The passengers in first class finished their cigars and brandy. The immigrants in steerage curled up on their bunks, dreaming of America. And Charles Joughin, the baker, closed his eyes, thinking perhaps of the next day's inventory, or a letter home, or simply the sweet relief of rest. He did not know that he was lying on top of a ticking clock. The ocean does not care about engineering. It does not care about tonnage or horsepower. It respects only physics. And the physics of that night were deadly simple. A mass of ice, millions of tons heavy, harder than concrete, was drifting south on the Labrador Current. A mass of steel, 46,000 tons heavy, was steaming west at 22 knots. They were on a collision course that had been set in motion weeks before, when the ice calved from a glacier in Greenland and began its slow, silent migration. At 11:40 p.m., the mathematics of the collision resolved. It did not begin with a bang. For most of the ship it began with a shudder, a long grinding vibration that felt less like an impact and more like the ship was clearing its throat. In the upper decks, drinks rattled on tables. In the dining saloon, silver clinked against china. But down below, closer to the waterline, the sensation was different. It was a tearing sound. The sound of steel screaming as it was forced to bend beyond its limit. The iceberg didn't smash into the ship. It scraped along the side, acting like a can opener, popping rivets and buckling plates. It was a surgical wound, a long, thin gash that opened the belly of the ship to the sea. In his cabin off E-deck, Charles Joughin woke up. He didn't wake up from the noise. He woke up because the rhythm had stopped. The engines, the heartbeat of the ship had gone silent. The vibration that had rocked him to sleep was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural, wrong. He sat up. The air in the cabin was still warm, still smelling of the bakery. He listened. There was no alarm, no siren, just the sound of footsteps running in the corridor outside. Not panic. Not yet. Just urgency. Joughin was a man of action, but he was also a man of hierarchy. He waited for orders. In the merchant marine, You do not act without a command. You stay at your post. You wait for the officer to tell you what is happening. But the orders did not come. The silence stretched. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Curiosity won out over discipline. Joughin stood up, pulled on his trousers, and stepped out into the passageway. The lights were still on. The electric hum of the ship's generator was steady. But the angle of the floor, was it his imagination? Or was there a slight, almost imperceptible tilt toward the bow? He walked toward the bakery. His staff were already awake, standing in the flour-dusted aisle, looking at each other with confusion. "What is it, Chief?" one of them asked. "Did we throw a propeller blade?" "I don't know," Joughin said. His voice was calm. It was the voice of a man who managed a factory, a man used to solving problems. "Get the ovens checked. Make sure the dampers are closed. We don't want a fire if the ship rolls." It was a sensible order, a practical order, but it was an order for a world that no longer existed. Joughin moved up the decks, seeking information. As he climbed, he began to notice the change in the atmosphere. On the lower decks, the crew was moving with purpose, checking watertight doors, whispering about water in the mailroom, water in the squash court. He reached the promenade deck. Here the air was freezing. The wind cut through his thin shirt. He saw passengers milling about, some in fur coats, some in pajamas, laughing nervously. They were kicking at chunks of ice that lay on the deck, debris from the collision. "Souvenirs," a man joked, holding up a piece of the iceberg. "Ice for the whiskey." Joughin did not laugh. He looked out at the black water. He looked at the lifeboats, still diverted to the sides of the ship, covered in canvas. He looked at the crew members struggling to uncover them, and then he heard the word. It wasn't shouted. It was passed from person to person like a contagion. Sinking. It seemed impossible. The lights were blazing. The band was assembling in the lounge. The ship felt solid, immense, permanent. But the word hung in the cold air, refusing to dissolve. Joughin turned back toward the stairs. He descended again into the warmth of the ship. He went back to his cabin. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't grab a life vest. Not yet. He did something that, in hindsight, seems trivial, almost absurd. But it was the action of a man trying to impose order on chaos. He summoned his staff. "Get the bread up," he ordered. "The bread, Chief. The biscuits, the loaves, everything we have. Get it up to the boat deck, put it in the lifeboats. If we are going into the boats, people will need to eat." It was a baker's solution to a maritime disaster. While the engineers fought to keep the pumps running, while the wireless operators tapped out frantic distress calls to ships that were too far away, Charles Joughin worried about hunger. He and his men began the arduous task of hauling baskets of bread up the stairs. It was heavy, grueling work. They carried sack after sack, navigating corridors that were beginning to crowd with confused passengers. They were invisible men, ghostly figures covered in white flour, weaving through the panicked throng of the wealthy. Joughin worked with a detached efficiency. He saw the fear in the faces of the women clutching their children. He saw the confusion in the eyes of the men who were realizing that there were not enough boats. He saw the cracks forming in the social veneer of the Edwardian age. But he kept moving, up and down, up and down. After the last basket was delivered, Joughin returned to his cabin on E-deck. The tilt of the ship was undeniable now. Walking toward the bow felt like walking downhill. Walking toward the stern felt like climbing a gentle slope. He sat on his bunk. He was tired. His arms ached from the carrying. The adrenaline that had fueled the initial burst of activity was fading, replaced by a cold, creeping realization of the scale of the disaster. The ship was groaning. Deep in the structure, steel was twisting. Partitions were buckling under the pressure of the rising water. The sounds were no longer mechanical. They were organic. The ship sounded like a dying animal. Joughin looked at the bottle on his shelf. It was whiskey. Not the expensive single malt served in the first-class smoking room, but a working man's spirit. Harsh, burning, effective. He reached for it. This moment, the hand closing around the glass neck of the bottle, is the pivot point of his story. It is the moment where history usually turns away. We like our heroes to be stoic, clear-headed, acting with razor-sharp precision. We do not like them to drink. We view alcohol in a crisis as a weakness, a surrender, a way to numb the mind against the horror. But for Joughin, it wasn't about numbness, it was about fuel. He uncorked the bottle. The smell of the alcohol mixed with the smell of the bakery. He took a drink. It hit his stomach like a hot coal. He felt the warmth spread through his chest, radiating out to his fingertips. It slowed his heart rate. It steadied his hands. It pushed back the creeping panic that was scratching at the back of his mind. He didn't chug it. He drank it with the deliberate pace of a man taking medicine. He wasn't drunk, not yet. He was fortified. He stood up. The bottle went into his pocket. He was done with baking. He was done with delivering bread. Now, he had to figure out how to survive. But as he moved back into the corridor, he found the ship had changed again. The order was gone. The quiet confusion had been replaced by a rising hysteria. The stairwells were clogged. People were shouting, shoving, crying. The officers were shouting orders that no one could hear. Joughin realized that the lifeboats, the ones he had stocked with bread, were leaving, and they were leaving half empty. He saw a boat being lowered, swinging wildly in the davits. He saw the gap between the boat and the deck, a terrifying chasm of black air. He saw women refusing to jump. He stepped forward. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for an officer. He grabbed a woman by the arm. She was frozen, her eyes wide with terror. "You have to go," he said. She shook her head. "I can't." Joughin didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply picked her up. He was a strong man, used to hauling 100-pound sacks of flour. And he threw her. Not violently, but decisively. He tossed her across the gap into the waiting boat. Then he grabbed another, and another. He was working again. It was just a different kind of labor. Instead of loaves into an oven, it was people into boats. He moved with a mechanical rhythm. Grab, lift, toss. Grab, lift, toss. He was rough. He was efficient. He was terrifyingly calm. The alcohol was working. It had stripped away the hesitation. It had silenced the voice that said, "This is madness." It allowed him to focus on the immediate physical task, move the object from the sinking platform to the floating one. But as the boats dropped away, disappearing into the dark, Joughin realized something. He was still on the ship. The boat deck was emptying, the crowd was thinning, moving aft, chasing the rising stern like insects fleeing a flood. The bow was gone, swallowed by the sea. The water was climbing the stairs, deck by deck, extinguishing the lights as it came. Joughin was alone. He looked around. There were no more boats. There were no more rafts. There was only the ship, the water, and the cold. He took another drink. The liquid courage coursed through him. He felt a strange detachment. He wasn't afraid. He should have been terrified. He should have been paralyzed by the prospect of the freezing water. But he felt ready. He walked toward the pantry. If he was going to die, he wouldn't die hungry. And he wouldn't die thirsty. He found water rising in the E-deck corridor. It was black, oily, and swirling with debris. Shoes, letters, playing cards, photographs, the detritus of 2,000 lives floating in the invading sea. He waded through it, the cold bit at his ankles, soaking his trousers. But his core was warm. The whiskey was a furnace in his belly. He reached the pantry door. It was locked. He kicked it. Once. Twice. The wood splintered. He went inside. He found more alcohol. He drank. It is easy to judge him here, to see a man raiding the liquor cabinet while the world ends. But look closer. This was a man who had accepted his fate. He wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was simply trying to make the end bearable. He was waiting for the ship to die, but the ship was taking a long time to die, and as Joughin waited, the floor tilted steeper and steeper. The crashing of furniture sliding across the decks above sounded like thunder. The screams of the passengers clinging to the rails drifted down like the cries of gulls. Joughin decided to go back up. He wouldn't drown in a pantry like a rat. If he was going to go, he would go under the sky. He climbed the stairs one last time. The angle was severe now. He had to pull himself up by the banisters, hand over hand, his feet slipping on the polished linoleum. He emerged onto the boat deck. It was a scene from a nightmare. The ship was breaking apart. The forward funnel had collapsed, crushing swimmers in the water. The stern was rising high into the air, lifting the propellers out of the sea for the first time since they were installed in Belfast. The crowd was a huddled mass near the stern railing. They were praying, they were screaming, they were silent. Joughin didn't join them. He didn't want to be part of the panic. He wanted space. He looked around for something, anything that floats. The lifeboats were gone, the collapsibles were gone. He saw a pile of deck chairs, wooden slatted folding chairs, the kind used for leisurely afternoons in the sun. He walked over to them. The ship lurched. He steadied himself against the rail. He picked up a chair. He walked to the side. He threw it overboard. He watched it splash into the black water below. It bobbed back up, it floated. He picked up another and another. He became a machine again. Lift, walk, throw, lift, walk, throw. He wasn't throwing them for himself. He was throwing them for the people already in the water. He was creating a debris field, a desperate constellation of wooden islands for the drowning. He threw 50 chairs, maybe more. His arms burned. His breath came in ragged gasps. But he kept working. Around him, the chaos reached a crescendo. The lights flickered. The generator was failing. The great electric heart of the ship was suffering a cardiac arrest. And then darkness. The lights died. The ship was now just a massive shadow against the stars. Joughin stopped throwing chairs. There were no more to throw. He stood by the rail. He was on the starboard side near the stern. The ship was groaning, a terrible rending sound of metal tearing apart. He felt the deck drop beneath his feet. Not a slide, but a fall. The ship was breaking in two. He didn't scream, he didn't scramble. He climbed. He climbed over the railing. He stood on the outside of the ship, holding onto the steel rail, looking down at the hull that was now vertical. He was standing on the side of the Titanic as if it were a cliff face. He took a moment. He checked his pocket. The bottle was gone. He tightened his belt. He adjusted his tunic. He felt the ship begin its final plunge. It wasn't fast. It was a slow, majestic glide. The stern, freed from the weight of the water-filled bow, hung in the air for a moment, then began to descend. Joughin rode it down. He didn't jump. He didn't dive. He simply held on until the water was close enough to step into. He described it later as stepping off a moving elevator. He stepped off the ship and into the Atlantic Ocean. His head did not go under. The water didn't even wet his hair. He was floating. And the cold, the lethal, paralyzing cold that was stopping the hearts of 1,000 people around him, did not come. He paddled away from the suction of the sinking Leviathan. He watched the stern disappear. He watched the bubbles rise. And then he was alone in the silence. The silence had returned. But Charles Joughin was still alive, and he was warm. The grand ambition of the Titanic lay in ruins at the bottom of the sea. The class systems, the hubris, the schedules, the bread, it was all gone, but the baker was still there, treading water in the dark, fueled by spirits, refusing to freeze. This is where the legend begins. Not with the ship, but with the man who refused to feel the cold. But to understand why he survived, we must understand what was happening inside his body. We have to look past the miracle and into the biology. Because while Joughin felt warm, the Atlantic was busy trying to kill him. He looked at the stars. They were bright, brighter than he had ever seen them. He began to swim, not toward anything in particular, just away from the screams, away from the wreckage. He swam with a slow, steady stroke. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to enter the history books not as a baker, but as a medical anomaly. The night was long, the water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and Charles Joughin was just getting started. The water of the North Atlantic is not merely cold. It is a physical assault. When a human body enters water that is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees below the freezing point of fresh water, kept liquid only by its salt content, the reaction is instantaneous and violent. It is called the cold shock response. The skin cools rapidly. The blood vessels in the outer layers of the body constrict violently, slamming shut in a desperate attempt to shunt warm blood to the core, to the heart and the lungs and the brain. The lungs spasm. The victim involuntarily gasps, inhaling a sudden, sharp breath. If their head is underwater when this happens, they drown immediately. If their head is above water, they begin to hyperventilate. Panic sets in. The heart rate rockets. Logic vanishes. This is the biology of dying in the sea. It is a mechanism designed by evolution to preserve life, but in these temperatures it usually accelerates death. But Charles Joughin did not gasp. He did not panic. When he stepped off the stern of the Titanic, gliding into the black ocean as if stepping off a curb, his body defied the natural order. The alcohol in his system, that significant quantity of spirits consumed over the last 2 hours, had created a chemical barrier between his mind and the reality of his situation. Alcohol is a vasodilator. It relaxes the walls of the blood vessels, allowing blood to flow more freely near the surface of the skin. In a survival manual, this is exactly what you are told not to do. By keeping the blood near the skin, you lose heat faster. You turn your body into a radiator, pumping your precious core warmth out into the freezing ocean. Scientifically, Joughin should have frozen to death faster than anyone else. But the ocean is a place of paradoxes. While the alcohol may have been mechanically inefficient for heat retention, it was psychologically essential. It suppressed the terror. It suppressed the cold shock. Joughin did not feel the freezing knife of the water. He felt a dull, numbing sensation. He did not thrash. He did not waste energy fighting a panic that never arrived. He paddled. He moved his arms and legs with a slow, rhythmic cadence. He was treading water in the center of a tragedy, yet he felt strangely removed from it. He was an island of calm in a sea of hysteria. Around him, the night was filled with a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It was a chaotic, discordant roar, the voices of hundreds of people struggling in the water, screams for help, prayers, names being shouted into the dark. It was a wall of noise that rose up from the surface of the sea, a collective plea to a universe that was not listening. Joughin ignored it. He realized with the detached clarity of the intoxicated that getting close to that mass of struggling humanity was dangerous. A drowning person will climb on top of anything to get out of the water, including another person. So he swam away. He paddled toward the emptiness. He looked for the white shapes of flotsam, the deck chairs he had thrown earlier, the pieces of paneling. But mostly he just kept moving. Time in the freezing Atlantic behaves differently than time on land. On land, a minute is 60 seconds. In the water, a minute is an eternity of heat exchange. The thermal conductivity of water is 25 times greater than that of air. Every second, the ocean was stealing calories from Joughin's body. It was a silent theft, a gradual bankruptcy of life energy. Most of the people in the water died within 20 minutes. They didn't drown. They simply stopped. Their muscles grew rigid. Their nerves stopped firing. Their hearts, overwhelmed by the cold and the stress, stuttered and failed. But 20 minutes passed, then 30. The noise began to fade. The wall of sound crumbled, replaced by isolated cries, then whimpers, and finally a terrible, heavy silence. Joughin was still paddling. He was alone now. The great ship was gone. The lights were gone. There was only the starlight, reflecting on the glassy swells. He checked his own state. He could still feel his feet. He could still move his fingers. He wasn't shivering. He floated on his back for a while, looking up at the constellations. They were sharp and clear, indifferent witnesses. He wondered if he was dead. It seemed plausible. The transition might have been so subtle he hadn't noticed. Perhaps this was the afterlife, a quiet, cold float through the cosmos. But then water splashed into his mouth, salty and stinging, and he knew he was still in the world of the living. He began to swim again. He didn't know where he was going. There was no north, no south, no destination. There was only the imperative of motion. Keep moving. If you stop, you sink. He encountered bodies now. They bumped against him in the dark, soft and yielding. He pushed them away without horror. They were just obstacles, debris. The alcohol had severed the emotional connection to the tragedy. He was not a mourner. He was a mechanic of his own survival. An hour passed. The cold was beginning to win the argument with the whiskey. The warmth in his belly was fading, replaced by a deep, aching chill that seemed to emanate from his bones. His movements became slower. The water felt thicker, heavier, like syrup. He needed to get out. In the distance, through the gloom, he saw a shape. It wasn't an iceberg, it was low and dark, bobbing in the swell. He swam toward it. It was a lifeboat, or rather the underside of one. It was Collapsible B, one of the Engelhardt collapsible boats, canvas sides with a wooden bottom. It had been washed off the deck as the ship went down, landing upside down in the water. It was a precarious refuge. The hull was slick and curved, offering no handholds. Clinging to the top of it were 24 men. They were standing, kneeling, lying on the slippery upturned keel, huddled together like a colony of seals. They were balancing on a knife edge. Every time a swell rolled through, the boat rocked, threatening to spill them all back into the sea. Joughin reached the side of the boat. He reached up, his hand searching for a grip. "Hold on," a voice shouted from the darkness. "Don't come aboard, we're full." It was the voice of Second Officer Lightoller. He was trying to command a shipwreck on a piece of wood, no larger than a dining room table. He knew that one more body, 180 pounds of wet baker, could destabilize the entire raft and kill everyone. "Push him off," someone else yelled. "We'll capsize." Joughin didn't argue. He didn't have the breath to argue, but he didn't let go. He found a gap between two men. He wedged his hand in. He hung there, his body submerged in the freezing water up to his shoulders, his head tilted back, holding onto the gunwale of the overturned boat. He was in a state of purgatory, not fully in the sea, but not fully out of it. Beside him, holding onto the same precarious strip of wood, was a familiar face. It was Isaac Maynard, one of the cooks. They recognized each other in the gloom. Two men from the galleys, two men who had spent their lives feeding the ship, now clinging to its wreckage. Maynard reached out. He grabbed Joughin's hand. He held it tight. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. In that temperature, contact is life. Maynard's hand prevented Joughin from slipping away when his grip strength began to fail, and fail it did. The alcohol could only do so much. The physics of the Atlantic were asserting their dominance. Joughin's legs went numb, then his waist. He could no longer feel the water. He only felt the absence of sensation. His body was shutting down the periphery, sacrificing the limbs to keep the brain alive. He hung there for another hour, maybe two. The conversation on the overturned boat was sparse. Men prayed. They muttered about the cold. Occasionally a man would lose his balance or his strength and slide silently off the hull and vanish. The group would shift their weight to compensate, a macabre balancing act. Joughin watched the horizon. He was looking for the dawn. He had always been a morning person. A baker's life is defined by the dawn. You rise before the sun. You work in the dark so that others can wake to the smell of bread. He fixed his mind on that rhythm. The sun would come. It had to come. And slowly, agonizingly, it did. The sky to the east began to bruise. It turned a deep violet purple, then a bruised grey. The black wall of the night dissolved, revealing the world they had been floating in. It was a terrifying revelation. They were not in the open ocean. They were in a field of ice. Giant white shapes surrounded them, towering hundreds of feet into the air. Icebergs, silent sentinels that had gathered to watch the aftermath. Some were pink in the morning light, beautiful and deadly. Debris littered the water for miles. Deck chairs, crates, cork lifebelts, and bodies, hundreds of them, bobbing in their white life jackets like a flock of sleeping gulls. But Joughin looked past the dead. He looked for smoke, and there it was, a single column of black smoke on the horizon. A ship, the Carpathia. A cheer went up from the survivors on the boat, a ragged, frozen, desperate sound. "She's coming," Lightoller said. "Steady, lads, steady." The sight of the rescue ship injected a final burst of adrenaline into Joughin's system. The alcohol was long gone, metabolized into nothing, but the will to live remained. The Carpathia steamed carefully through the ice field, her engines dead slow, her crew lining the rails. Lifeboats from the Titanic, those that had launched successfully, began to row toward her. Collapsible B was in no condition to row. They had no oars, they were sinking. The air pocket under the hull was leaking out. The boat was sitting lower and lower in the water. Another lifeboat, number 12, spotted them. It rowed over, maneuvering carefully alongside the unstable upturned hull. "Transfer," the officer in number 12 shouted. "One by one. Slowly." This was the moment of truth for Joughin. He had been in the water for nearly 3 hours. By all medical logic, he should have been a corpse. If not dead, he should have been crippled by severe hypothermia, unable to speak, unable to move, his heart fibrillating. He let go of Isaac Maynard's hand. He let go of the gunwale. He pushed himself away from the boat. He swam. He swam toward lifeboat 12. It was a short distance, but he covered it. He reached up. Strong hands grabbed his tunic. They hauled him over the side. He tumbled into the bottom of the boat, landing among women and children who looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his skull, his skin grey. But he was alive. As the lifeboat made its way to the Carpathia, Joughin didn't collapse. He didn't fall into a coma. He sat up. He looked around. When they reached the side of the rescue ship, a canvas sling was lowered for the survivors, who were too weak to climb the rope ladders. Most of the men from Collapsible B had to be hoisted up, their frozen limbs useless. Joughin looked at the sling. He looked at the ladder. He stood up. He grabbed the ropes. He began to climb. It is an image that defies comprehension. A man who had spent the night in freezing water, who had watched his ship die, who had watched his friends die, pulling himself up the side of a ship, hand over hand, rung by rung. He reached the deck of the Carpathia. A steward rushed forward to help him, expecting him to collapse. Joughin waved him off. "I'm all right," he said. His voice was raspy but clear. He wasn't shivering. He walked across the deck. He found a place out of the wind. And then, for the first time in 12 hours, the Baker stopped moving. The doctors on the Carpathias were overwhelmed. They were treating fractures, burns, shock, and profound hypothermia. They moved from patient to patient, wrapping them in warm blankets, administering brandy and coffee. When they got to Joughin, they were confused. His body temperature was low, yes, but not critical. His pulse was strong. He was lucid. He was hungry. "How long were you in the water?" a doctor asked, checking Joughin's eyes for signs of dilation. "I don't know," Joughin replied, "until the sun came up." The doctor paused. He looked at the man's wet clothes. He looked at the freezing sea over the rail. "That's not possible," the doctor muttered. "You would be dead." Joughin shrugged. He didn't have a medical explanation. He only had his reality. "I had a drink," Joughin said, "before I went in." "A drink?" "Aye, spirits." The doctor shook his head. He wrote it down in his notebook, but he didn't believe it. Or rather, he couldn't reconcile it with what he knew of physiology. Alcohol makes you colder. Everyone knew that. A drunk man in the snow dies faster than a sober one. But here was Charles Joughin, sitting on a crate, drying out like a piece of laundry, while stronger, younger, sober men lay dead in the makeshift morgue on the deck below. It was an uncomfortable explanation. It didn't fit the narrative of heroism. It didn't fit the narrative of science. It suggested that survival wasn't about virtue or strength or preparation. It suggested that survival was about chemistry and luck. As the Carpathia turned her bow toward New York, leaving the ice field behind, the story of the Titanic was already being written. The newspapers were already drafting headlines about the unsinkable ship, the heroism of the band, the cowardice of the owner, the tragedy of the lost. But in the margins of that great story, sitting quietly with a blanket over his shoulders, was the Baker. He was the anomaly, the man who cheated the Atlantic. He didn't feel like a hero, he just felt tired, and he missed his oven. The heat of the bakery seemed like a dream now, a distant memory of a world that had burned and drowned. He closed his eyes. The motion of the Carpathia was different from the Titanic. It was smaller, rougher, but it was moving. He was safe. But the questions were just beginning. As the ship steamed west, Joughin realized that surviving the water was the easy part. Explaining why he survived, that would be the struggle that lasted a lifetime. The mystery of his survival would become a point of contention, a joke, a myth, and finally, a scientific curiosity. But on that morning, April 15th, 1912, it was just a fact. The Baker was alive, and the bottle was empty. History usually demands a cleanup. It likes to sweep the debris off the stage, categorize the dead, medal the heroes, and file the paperwork. But after the Carpathia docked in New York, and the flashing bulbs of the press photographers faded, the story of the Titanic entered a new phase. It moved from the chaos of the ocean to the sterile, wood-paneled rooms of the inquiry. In London, inside the Scottish Drill Hall, the British Rec Commissioners' Court was assembled. It was a place of stiff collars, dry coughing, and the rustling of heavy paper. The air smelled of floor wax and judgment. Lord Mersey sat high on the bench, a man whose job was to apply the rigid logic of British law to a disaster that defied all reason. They called everyone. They called the surviving officers, who spoke of ice warnings and ship speeds. They called the owners, who spoke of bulkheads and insurance. And then they called the baker. Charles Joughin walked into the room not as a celebrity, but as a curiosity. He stood in the witness box, a man of the working class surrounded by the aristocracy of the legal system. He was there to explain the unexplainable. The transcript of his testimony is one of the most surreal documents in maritime history. It reads less like a legal interrogation and more like a comedy of errors performed at a funeral. The barrister asked him, "Did you see anyone in the water?" Joughin replied, "I saw hundreds." "Did you feel the cold?" "No, sir." "How long were you in the water?" "I don't know, perhaps 2 hours, perhaps 3. The court was silent. The experts in the room, men who had studied physiology, men who knew the thermal dynamics of the human body, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew the tables. They knew the charts. A man in 28-degree water has 15 minutes of useful consciousness. After that, he is a drifting object. After an hour, he is dead. 3 hours was not a statistic. It was a ghost story. Then came the inevitable question, the question that would define Joughin's legacy, overshadowing his leadership, his chair-throwing, and his discipline. "Had you had drink?" Joughin didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He answered with the blunt honesty of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it wanting. "I had a drop," he said. The gallery murmured. A drop in the parlance of the merchant navy could mean anything from a sip to a bottle. The lawyers pressed him. They wanted to know exactly how much alcohol was required to survive the apocalypse. Joughin detailed his consumption, the whiskey in the cabin, the spirits in the pantry. He recounted it like a recipe. He wasn't bragging about being drunk. He was explaining his fuel intake. The press loved it. The headlines wrote themselves, "The Drunk Baker." It was a caricature that was easy to digest. It fit the narrative of the lower classes, rough, unrefined, surviving through vice while the gentlemen on the upper decks died with dignity. It was a convenient way to dismiss the anomaly. He didn't survive because he was strong. He survived because he was pickled. But the medical community was not laughing. To them, Joughin was a problem. In 1912, the understanding of hypothermia was rudimentary, but the basics were known. Alcohol causes vasodilation. It opens the capillaries. It flushes blood to the skin. It makes you feel warm, yes, but it accelerates heat loss. It is a false warmth. If you drink whiskey in a snowbank, you will feel cozy right up until the moment your heart stops. By all the laws of medicine, Charles Joughin should have been the first to die. His core temperature should have plummeted. His decision to drink should have been a suicide note. Yet he walked out of the inquiry alive. This contradiction created a rift in the story of the Titanic. On one side, you had the official history, the tragedy of hubris, the band playing Nearer My God to Thee, the captain going down with the ship. This was the romantic, tragic version that the public craved. On the other side, you had the baker, a man who got tight on whiskey, threw furniture into the sea, paddled around for 3 hours and climbed a ladder to safety. His story was messy. It was human. It didn't fit the operatic tone of the disaster. So history began to edit him. In the years that followed, Joughin's name appeared in the books, but always as a footnote. He was the comic relief in a horror movie. He was the anecdote used to lighten the mood after the description of the freezing children. But Joughin himself did not seem to care about his legacy. He did not write a memoir. He did not tour the vaudeville circuit telling tales of the deep. He did not sell his autograph. He did what most survivors of trauma do. He went back to work. There is a profound quiet in the life of Charles Joughin after 1912. It is the quiet of a man who has seen the worst the world can do and decided to keep moving. He returned to Liverpool. He signed on to other ships. He went back to the ovens. It is difficult to imagine what it must have been like for him to stand on the deck of a new ship, looking out at the same black ocean at night, to feel the vibration of the engines and remember the silence of the Titanic, to smell the yeast and flour and remember the panic in the pantry. Did he dream of the water? Did he wake up shivering? We don't know. He didn't tell reporters about his nightmares. He was of a generation that did not speak of post-traumatic stress. They spoke of nerves, and the cure for nerves was duty. But the ocean wasn't done with him. History has a strange way of rhyming. In 1914, the world broke apart again. The Great War began. The Atlantic became a battlefield. U-boats patrolled the shipping lanes, turning the ocean into a hunting ground. Joughin was serving on the SS Congress. In 1916, the ship caught fire off the coast of California. Once again, Joughin found himself on a burning vessel. Once again, there was smoke. Once again, there was the order to abandon ship. He survived. Later, he served on the SS Oregon. It sank in the approaches to New York Harbor after a collision. He survived that too. He became a man who could not be drowned, a man who seemed to have an understanding with the sea. You can take the ship, the ocean seemed to say, but you cannot take the baker. By the 1920s, Charles Joughin had moved to the United States. He settled in Paterson, New Jersey, a quintessential American industrial town, far from the glamour of the White Star Line. He worked as a baker. He married. He had a daughter. He lived a life of aggressive normalcy. But the legend of the Titanic was growing. It was transforming from a news event into a myth. Movies were made. Books were written. The ship became a metaphor for the end of the Edwardian era, for the loss of innocence. In the 1950s, a writer named Walter Lord began researching a book that would become the definitive account of the disaster, A Night to Remember. Lord didn't just want the official reports, he wanted the voices. He tracked down the survivors who were still alive. He found Joughin in New Jersey. The interview notes from that meeting are fascinating. Joughin was older now, his hair grey, his face lined, but his memory was sharp. He told Lord the same story he had told the inquiry 40 years earlier. The whiskey, the chairs, the paddling. But there was a difference in how the story was received. Walter Lord was not a judge. He was a storyteller. He saw the humanity in Joughin's actions. He saw that the alcohol wasn't the point. The refusal to panic was the point. When A Night to Remember was published, and later turned into a film, Charles Joughin was finally given his due. In the movie, he is shown clinging to the rail as the ship goes vertical, sharing a flask, calm amidst the apocalypse. It was a vindication, but it was also a simplification. The film turned him into a character, the plucky Brit. It stripped away the terror of the 3 hours in the water. It didn't show the bodies bumping against him in the dark. It didn't show the moment he had to be hauled over the gunwale of Lifeboat 12, his legs useless. It made survival look like a quirk of personality, rather than a grueling physical ordeal. Joughin died in 1956, just a few years after the movie came out. He died in a hospital in Paterson, New Jersey. He didn't die of drowning, he didn't die of hypothermia. He died of pneumonia, a lung infection. There is a dark irony there. The lungs that had held the breath of life while floating in the freezing Atlantic finally failed him in a warm hospital bed. He was buried in a modest grave. There is no massive monument, no statue of a man holding a loaf of bread and a bottle of whiskey. But his story refused to be buried with him. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, science began to catch up with the legend. The field of hypothermia research advanced significantly, driven by the military's need to keep pilots alive in cold water. Researchers began to look back at the case of the Titanic baker. They stopped laughing at the alcohol theory and started analyzing it. They looked at the psychology of survival. They looked at the will to live. They looked at the physiology of panic, and they began to realize that Joughin wasn't just lucky. He was a perfect storm of biological and psychological factors. The alcohol didn't keep him warm. That was still physically impossible. But the alcohol might have done something else. It might have dampened the cold shock response just enough to prevent him from gasping in the first critical seconds. It might have stopped him from hyperventilating. More importantly, it kept him calm. Panic is a calorie burner. Panic causes you to thrash, to scream, to elevate your heart rate. All of that burns through your energy reserves. By staying calm, chemically calm, Joughin conserved his energy. He entered a vegetative state of survival. He became cold-blooded in a warm-blooded body. He became a creature of the environment, rather than a victim of it. But even with modern science, there are gaps. There are variables that cannot be calculated. Why him? Why not the others who drank? Why not the stokers who were physically stronger? Why not the officers who were better trained? The answer lies in the uncomfortable territory of chance. We like to believe that survival is a meritocracy, that the good survive, or the strong survive, or the smart survive. We want the disaster to have a moral compass, but the ocean has no moral compass. It is a chaotic system. A slightly different current, a slightly different layer of fat on the body, a slightly different position in the water, these microscopic variables determine life and death. Charles Joughin was the human variable that broke the equation. He represents the element of the Titanic story that remains unsolved. The ship is on the bottom. We have mapped every square inch of the wreck. We have brought up plates and shoes and whistles. We know exactly how the steel failed. We know exactly how the rivets popped. But we still don't fully understand the man who floated above it all. His legacy is not in the maritime laws that were changed, or the ice patrols that were established. His legacy is in the question he leaves behind. What is the limit of human endurance? And what happens when we stop being afraid of the dark? In the final reckoning, Charles Joughin's life after the Titanic was a victory of the ordinary. He didn't let the disaster define him. He baked bread. He raised a family. He paid his taxes. He took the most extraordinary event of the century and turned it into just another bad night at work. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing of all. He didn't just survive the water, he survived the memory of it. He refused to drown in the past, but the story isn't quite over. Because while Joughin faded into history, the science of what happened to him continued to evolve. And as we look at his survival through the lens of modern medicine, we find that the drunk baker might have accidentally stumbled upon a survival secret that biology is only just beginning to understand. The bottle was a crutch, yes, but the mind that held the bottle, that was the engine. And to understand that engine, we have to look one last time at the physics of the fall, at the moment when the lights went out, and one man decided that the end of the world was just a problem to be solved, one sip at a time. To understand the anomaly of Charles Joughin, we must first strip away the romance of the Titanic. We must look at the event not as a tragedy of Greek proportions, but as a biological experiment conducted on a massive scale. The Atlantic Ocean that night was a laboratory. The variable was cold. The subjects were 2,000 human beings, and the results were brutally consistent. When the human body is submerged in water near freezing, it follows a predictable script of deterioration. First, the cold shock. Then, the loss of dexterity. The fingers stiffen, unable to tie a knot or strike a match. Then the blood leaves the extremities. The arms and legs become heavy, useless weights. Finally, the core temperature drops below 90 degrees. Consciousness fades. The heart, confused by the chemical imbalance, flutters into fibrillation and stops. This is the law of the sea. It is absolute. But Charles Joughin broke the law. And for decades, scientists and historians have argued over how he did it. The popular theory, the one whispered in bars and printed in tabloids, was simple. The alcohol acted as antifreeze. It preserved him like a specimen in a jar. But modern medicine tells us this is a myth. Ethanol lowers the freezing point of blood by a negligible amount. You would be dead from alcohol poisoning long before your blood became resistant to ice. So if it wasn't antifreeze, what was it? Recent studies into cold water survival suggest a more complex, more fascinating answer. It wasn't that the alcohol kept Joughin warm. It was that the alcohol made him indifferent. Fear is a physiological storm. When a person panics, their body dumps adrenaline into the bloodstream. The metabolic rate spikes. The body burns through its energy reserves at a terrifying speed, trying to fight a threat it cannot defeat. A panicked swimmer in freezing water is like a furnace running with the door open. They exhaust themselves within minutes. Joughin did not panic. The sedative effect of the whiskey, combined with his own pragmatic temperament, placed him in a state of suspended animation. He moved slowly. He breathed slowly. He did not waste a single calorie on terror. He didn't fight the cold. He coexisted with it. There is also the matter of insulation. Joughin was a baker. It was a job that allowed for frequent snacking. He was a man of stocky build, with a layer of subcutaneous fat that many of the stokers and sailors, lean from hard labor, did not possess. In the water, fat is life. It is the biological wetsuit. And finally, there was the timing. Joughin was the last man off the ship. He didn't jump into the water while the ship was still high above the surface. He stepped off. He didn't wet his head. This is a critical detail. The head is a primary source of heat loss. By keeping his hair dry for the first hour, paddling calmly in the darkness, he retained a thermal advantage that others lost the moment they plunged into the sea. It was a perfect alignment of variables: chemistry, biology, physics, and luck, a combination that occurs perhaps once in a billion chances. But history does not like variables. It likes archetypes. As the years distanced the world from the disaster, the story of the Titanic calcified into a set of rigid symbols. Captain Smith became the symbol of duty. Bruce Ismay became the symbol of cowardice. The unsinkable Molly Brown became the symbol of resilience. Charles Joughin became the anecdote. He was the funny drunk, the footnote in the history books. His survival was treated as a fluke, a bit of comic relief in a narrative of overwhelming grief. This reduction of his life is a disservice to what he actually accomplished. It ignores the leadership he showed before he took that first drink. It ignores the women he threw into the boats. It ignores the deck chairs he tossed overboard, chairs that, according to some survivor accounts, actually saved lives. We prefer our heroes to be pure. We want them to be stoic, sober, and noble. We are uncomfortable with a hero who saves himself by raiding the pantry. But survival is rarely noble. Survival is ugly. It is a desperate, clawing, scraping fight against extinction. Joughin represents the raw, unpolished reality of staying alive. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a speech. He just had a bottle and a refusal to stop moving. After the fame faded, Joughin returned to the anonymity of the working class. He did not capitalize on his survival. He did not become a professional Titanic survivor. He went back to the ovens. There is a profound poetry in his return to baking. The ocean is cold, chaotic, and destructive. A bakery is the opposite. It is warm. It is orderly. It is creative. To take flour, water, and yeast and turn it into bread is an act of civilization. It is an assertion of control over nature. For the rest of his life, Joughin lived in the warmth. He worked on American ships. He baked for troops during the Second World War. He saw the world change from the age of steam to the age of the atom. He walked the streets of Paterson, New Jersey, a man with a secret history. To his neighbors, he was just Charlie the baker. They didn't know that this man had ridden the stern of the greatest ship in the world down into the abyss and swum back up. Or perhaps they did know, and they just didn't know what to do with the information. It was too large. It didn't fit in the suburbs. When he died in 1956, the obituary was small. The world had moved on. The Titanic was an old story, a black and white memory of a foolish era. But the ocean remembers. Today, the wreck of the Titanic is disappearing. The iron-eating bacteria, Halomonas titanicae, is slowly consuming the steel. The great hull is collapsing into rust. The grand staircase is gone. The captain's bathtub is gone. Within a few decades, the ship will be nothing but a stain on the sediment. The physical evidence is vanishing. But the stories remain. And as we re-examine the disaster with the eyes of the 21st century, the figure of the baker looms larger. We live in an age of anxiety. We are obsessed with safety, with protocols, with control. We have GPS and satellite phones and thermal imagery. We believe that technology can protect us from the elements. The story of the Titanic reminds us that technology is fragile. The unsinkable ship lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. And the story of Charles Joughin reminds us of something else. It reminds us of the resilience of the human animal. When the systems failed, when the lights went out, when the radios died, it wasn't the machinery that survived, it was the flesh. Joughin forces us to confront the uncomfortable role of chance in our lives. We want to believe that we are the captains of our fate, but sometimes we are just swimmers in the dark. Sometimes the difference between life and death is not character or preparation or virtue. Sometimes it is just a flask of whiskey and a layer of fat. This is the human variable. It is the unpredictable spark that defies statistics. The legacy of Charles Joughin is not that he advocated for alcohol as a survival tool. It is that he proved the experts wrong. He proved that the boundaries of human endurance are not fixed. They are fluid. In the end, the image that stays with us is not the baker on the deck throwing chairs. It is the baker in the water. Imagine him there one last time. The ship is gone. The screaming has stopped. The water is black glass. The stars are hard and cold. He is alone in the center of the Atlantic. He is not swimming toward a rescue he knows is coming. He is swimming because the alternative is static. He is swimming because he is a man of work, and swimming is the work of the moment. He is the triumph of the mundane over the majestic. The Titanic was a monument to human arrogance. Charles Joughin was a monument to human persistence. The ship sank, the baker floated, and somewhere in the sensory memory of the world there is still the smell of his bread, the smell of life rising in the warmth, defying the cold, indifferent silence of the sea. The history books will always list the tonnage, the knots, and the names of the millionaires. They will argue over the binoculars and the bulkheads, but if you listen closely to the story, past the roar of the steam and the breaking of the iron, you can hear a different sound. It is the steady, rhythmic splash of a single man paddling through the night, refusing to die. Charles Joughin, the baker who beat the ice. The water closes over everything in the end. But some things, it seems, refuse to stay submerged.